The hearing will come to order. Good afternoon. We appreciate your patience in waiting through that series of votes, but it was most of the last votes for the day, so we will be uninterrupted by anything coming from the House floor. We welcome you to this first hearing that the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation is having on the role of the Department of Defense in the Provincial Reconstruction teams both in Iraq and Afghanistan. We chose this topic for this hearing because PRTs are considered to be so critical to our efforts both in Iraq and Afghanistan. PRTs also go to an issue that my colleague Mr. Aiken and I and other members of the committee have been interested in, that is examining in more depth how the interagency process is working, or for that matter is not working at the point of implementation and operations in the field. As we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, the national effort involves more than just military actions and instead requires integrated efforts and the resources of other governmental departments and agencies besides the Department of Defense. Provincial Reconstruction teams could be a case study of the need for an effective, integrated process to achieve government-wide unity of effort in complex contingency operations. When I talk about government-wide, I'm talking about U.S. government-wide unity of effort. In addition to getting a better understanding of the role DoD plays in the PRT program and how DoD personnel are selected and trained to serve on PRTs, we would also like to better understand how the PRTs are operating both in Iraq and Afghanistan, what they hope to accomplish, and how well they are doing, including how progress is measured and where we see things going in the future. We have a good panel of witnesses this afternoon. We appreciate you all being here. Deputy Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, Ginger Cruz. Ms. Cruz just returned from Iraq, where she's been involved with conducting an audit and examining the effectiveness of the PRT program. This is the third in a series of audits on PRTs that she's been working on. We understand that the results of the audit have not been formally released yet, but we will be interested in hearing about that work today. Ms. Michelle Parker served for a year and a half as a USAID representative on a PRT in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, and later became the development advisor to the NATO commander. She is currently at RAND on a fellowship. And Mr. Rick Barton, who is a co-director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies Post-Conflict Reconstruction Project, has experience in numerous post-conflict reconstruction settings. He co-authored a report earlier this year measuring progress in Afghanistan. We'd hope to have a witness today from the Department of Defense, but DoD thought it might perhaps work better to do that later on since we have so much DoD testimony coming over the next couple weeks on Iraq, and we look forward to their testimony as we progress. So I will now yield to Mr. Aiken for any comments he would like to make.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder. Is the power on here? Okay. First of all, good afternoon to our witnesses and to several of you at least. Thank you for your work in behalf of our nation and also for the different countries where you are serving. And we're just delighted to have you here. And this is a topic that a number of us have been interested in. It seems to keep emerging in various forms. And one of the things that would be helpful if in your testimony you could include it would be something about the sense that we have a military presence. We can say, okay, General, you go over there and fight this war or something, but we don't have the parallel in State Department or in Commerce or something else. And yet a lot of the work that's being done is not specifically military. So the question is, how do we structurally deal with that? How do we deal with the fact that we have no friendly media, for instance, over there? We don't know, the military doesn't have a section that says this is the people who put in a television station in a foreign country. So that's one of the things that gets pretty close to where I think some of you are working. So if you want to comment on that, that'd be a help. Get back to my text here. Today's hearing begins a new inquiry in this subcommittee, the role of the Department of Defense in the Provincial Reconstruction teams. While it's a new topic for the subcommittee, PRTs and the subject of stabilization operations is very much related to our previous work on the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi Alternative Hearing Series subcommittee conducted this past July. PRT is an interagency team comprised of civilian and military personnel employed in Iraq or Afghanistan with a mission of extending the reach of the government into regional provinces and local areas. While each PRT has a fair amount of autonomy to tailor its work to the needs of their province, it's important to note that PRTs in Iraq and Afghanistan do not have the same emphasis. As I understand it, Afghanistan PRTs focus on classic development projects such as improving road networks, adding to the supply of electricity and water, building schools and clinics. And PRT in Iraq, by contrast, place a stronger emphasis on capacity building, particularly as it relates to local and civil governments. It appears increasingly that effort in the area of local and civil government is going to be very important to us. Finally, another aspect of PRTs which I'm interested in is the interagency composition of the teams. I'd like to hear from today's witnesses their views on whether the PRTs are or should be a model for how to conduct interagency operations. While I know that PRTs face a number of challenges, I'm curious whether our witnesses believe that the teams are executing interagency operations effectively. You often hear that Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom require all elements of national power. Though I think it's been the exception, not the rule, when this has happened. This investigation should look into whether PRTs have the right mix of interagency expertise, clarify which agencies are underrepresented, and offer suggestions for what PRTs should look like. Again, I really appreciate your work. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Aiken. All your all's written statements will be made a part of the record, and we will begin with your oral statement. We'll start with Ms. Cruz.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Aiken, and members of the House Armed Services Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations. Thank you for inviting me to represent the Office of the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction to discuss the role of DoD and Provincial Reconstruction teams. I was part of the team that first did the research prior to our audit of PRTs back in July of 2006. And in the course of the last 14 months, I have actually been a couple of times to the primary PRTs all around the country, each of which is very different. We have done 3 audits on the PRT issue. We have released 2, and the third will be released in 2 weeks. I can't discuss any of the findings of the third audit until it is actually final and released, but much of the testimony that I have today will address our first 2 audits. Our first audit, in short, found that there were deep concerns about adequate logistical support and security agreements between the Department of Defense and the Department of State. In fact, it took about a year for the 2 agencies to sign a memorandum of understanding that put in place the security regulations that were necessary to support the PRT teams. That was something that we found in our second audit had been accomplished, and a lot of progress was made over that period of time. Our second audit looked at the surge and tried to ascertain if the surge was being implemented. We published that audit in June of 2007, and we found that generally the surge was on track. They were identifying more civilians to be able to fill positions, although the Department of Defense still had to come through with many of the personnel that were required for the effort. We found, I think our most important finding from our second audit, though, was that there was still a lack of defined objectives, milestones, and performance measures. And it's very difficult for people in the field who are doing their work under fire, under pressure, doing heroic work in many of these PRTs to figure out what it is that the end goal is that they are working towards. And so the need for there to be defined performance measures and defined objectives is very important for these people who are risking their lives to do this work, and we still find that they fall short in that area. The PRT concept, as currently developed, is set for 800 people across Iraq, and it has a $2 billion funding source, and that $2 billion is split between operational money and program money, and about half of that goes to programs, about half of that goes to operations. It is a 2-year-old project, and the PRT personnel basically do their work by conducting face-to-face meetings with provincial government officials in every one of those provinces. The Department of Defense generally provides security for all of the PRTs, and they provide life support, transportation, and a significant number of those 800 personnel slots in the PRTs. The State Department provides leadership for the overall PRT program. They provide staffing, they provide program and operational funding for the effort. Today there are 25 PRTs. We've brought a map for reference. There are 10 primary PRTs, of which 7 are run by the United States and 3 by coalition. And there are 15 EPRTs, which are embedded PRTs. Those are PRTs with the military in the lead and usually a team of 4 individuals underneath them who support the efforts of to build governance and capacity. They just recently added 4 more EPRTs. Although I will say that for the committee's understanding, in my view, every PRT is really an EPRT to some extent. Given the current situation in Iraq with security, there is, in my judgment, no way that a PRT could do its work without having the military supporting their operations. The one exception could perhaps be up in the north, in the Kurdish regions of Erbil, Sulaymaniyah, and Dahuk. There is a more permissive environment, and there might be a capability to do more of that work. But in the rest of Iraq, it is impossible for the PRTs to do their work without close integration with the military and their support for transportation and security. Among the key challenges that we address in the written testimony, personnel. Department of State and the civilian agencies have had a very difficult time finding personnel for these efforts. In some cases, we have found that because there is no ability to compel individuals with the right skill sets to go in, they rely on volunteers. And because of the dangers and because of the nuances of where this will put you on your career path within their civilian agencies, there's not necessarily a reward for a person within their career path to take the risk of working in Iraq and to put in a year or two working at these PRTs. So as a result, it is very difficult to find people with the right skill sets from civilian agencies and compel them to go to Iraq to work. In the case of the Department of Defense, they have no problem. They can find the right people and send them in. But the problem that we have found with DoD, which they are addressing, is finding people with the right skill sets. Too often we've found that there are people who are artillery experts or who are aviation mechanics who are doing heroic work, but they'll be sending them in to advise governors on how to build capacity development. And it's the wrong skill set. And they try very hard, and they're doing the best work that they can, but the skill match is not quite there yet. So the Department of Defense, we feel, could do a little bit more work in trying to match up the skills better to the job. They have done a better job of that. In the last time that I was out there, they were finding JAG officers to work rule of law. They're finding reservists with MBA degrees to work economic issues. So there has been progress in that area. On the issue of civilian-military integration, the problems that we are finding are that there is really no permanent, predictable method of integrating decision-making and resource sharing. Instead, there is a patchwork quilt of memoranda of agreement and fragos and military orders and cables that all together sort of provide the policy underpinnings that are used by PRTs. It makes it very difficult for the people in the field to figure out how to apply those rules and goals and missions because they're constantly changing, they're not set in stone, and they're not understood well by the teams. And without frequent communication, the policy is really not devolved down to the field level. So that is one of the problems that we have identified. Plus, the military is much better resourced. In many of these areas, you're talking 6,000 soldiers or more in an area on the streets. They've got millions of dollars in SERP funds. They've got billions of dollars in Iraq Security Forces funds. They've got helicopters. They've got vehicles. They can fly the governor down to see the ministries. They have all the resources. The PRTs, you're talking less than 100 people, in some cases less than $10 million. And so the disparity between the resources and the influence that the PRTs can bring and the resource and the influence that the military can bring is very significant. And so that necessitates very close coordination between the military and the PRTs. On the security front, again, the only way that you can move is with military support around the country, and that causes a lot of problems. Right now, if the Diyala team wants to meet with anybody in the governance center, or if the team from Mosul wants to go down and have a meeting with the governor, the only way they can do that is with a full complement of military, with Humvees and all of the security support. So the military is the only way that they can move around in those areas. They did look at private security, but that would have cost $2 billion, which is unsustainable, and so they have depended on the military to do that. On the issue of coordination, there's about $44 billion in U.S. money that's flowing around the country, and that's dozens of funds that are administered by several independent agencies. And Iraqi officials commonly suffer from something we call interlocutor fatigue, where a whole parade of U.S. officials, a major, a colonel, a PRT team leader, a USAID guy, a contractor who works for USAID, will come in at various points and will meet with Iraqi leaders. And so it's very easy to see how the Iraqis get extremely confused and how PRTs spend an inordinate amount of time trying to coordinate and still fall short because there's just too much coordination that needs to go on. There's too many funds, there's too many moving parts, and so it becomes a very difficult challenge for PRTs to not only manage the civilian agency military cooperation, but then you add to that the cooperation that they have to have with the government of Iraq, And then the last dimension is the government of Iraq itself has a bifurcated government system where you have local government that does not talk to the national level government. And so the PRTs are very often in the position where they not only are getting the American officials to talk to each other, but they're also getting Iraqi officials to talk to each other. And it becomes an almost impossible challenge, but they're doing very good work in that area. Quickly going through some positive developments. In the surge, we have seen the 10 PRTs stand up. They've got 5 more coming. Of the 804 slots that are dedicated for PRTs, 610 have been filled. The Department of Defense has filled 96% of its slots. The State Department has identified 68% of its slots. And that's in comparison with a year ago when there were 238 people staffing PRTs. 67% were from the State Department, from Defense Department, and 16% from the State Department. So there has been an increase in the amount of civilians that are coming in to staff the PRTs. One of the things that PRTs have decided to do to replicate DoD is to create something called a Quick Reaction Fund. SERP funds, as we have noted, have been very effective because they don't have a lot of bureaucracy. You have small amounts of money that you can apply on the ground quickly. And so the State Department recognized that, and they've taken their State Department money and created a new project, or a new program called QRF, where they're going to start with $200,000 per province to put that on the field. So that's a positive development. Ongoing challenges, the organization that leads PRTs is called the Office of Provincial Affairs, OPA. They have had 3 heads in 4 months. They're constantly changing the leadership, and all the people that work the primary coordination points between all of these 25 PRTs have almost completely changed out in the last 3 months. As a result, you've got people in the field who have very little support from headquarters in Baghdad, and that has been a huge challenge and a huge problem. The new head of OPA, who I met about 2 weeks ago, says that she is committed to stay in her post for 2 years. That will be significant because not many people do 2-year tours in Iraq, so that would be a significant improvement if that happens.
Ms. Cruz, what's her name?
Her name is Phyllis Powers. She is an ambassador. In closing, the PRT program is one of the most valuable programs that the United States runs today in Iraq. It has come a long way in a year, and with further improvements, it could serve as a model for civil-military stabilization and rehabilitation efforts. The PRT program expansion is on course, but in large measure because of the heroic efforts of the individuals that are in the field and actually doing the work. Thank you very much for your time and attention to these matters, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Cruz. Ms. Parker.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today. Starting in July of 2004, I began a 29-month tour in Afghanistan. First, I was a USAID Field Program Officer in the Jalalabad PRT, and then I was the Development Advisor to the Commanding General of the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force. The second position was actually created by the Commanding General, David Richards, because he believed in the concept of 3 Ds, of defense, development, and diplomacy being needed to succeed in Afghanistan. He was a military person, he had his POLAD, but he didn't have a development advisor. So he created the position, and USAID hired me to staff it. The reason I bring that up is because the 3D concept is essentially the foundation of the PRT. So today I'll describe my PRT structure in Jalalabad and the military's role in it, and then I'll end by suggesting concrete actions that Congress can take to support the larger PRT mission. My PRT's organizational structure varied greatly over my 20-month tour, but essentially we had 2 core components. First was something we called the Command Group, which consisted of USAID, the Departments of Agriculture, State, and Defense, and that was the Lieutenant Colonel as the military lead who participated in that. Secondly, we had support functions that consisted of 88 soldiers that did everything from force protection, civil affairs, medical, communications, logistics, and base operations, pretty much what you covered. To emphasize that point, there were 7 of us that did substantive issues. Everyone else was there in a support function. The PRT's mission in Afghanistan is to extend the reach of the Afghan government by enabling security sector reform and reconstruction and development. But it's also part of this much larger full-spectrum operation that ranges from combat operations that Marines and Special Forces are doing to aid midwife training that's going on down the street. So at the PRT, we were also responsible for trying to coordinate, at best, deconflict at worst, all of those different programs that the US government was doing in the area. The military's role in the PRT was twofold. First, they provided all the basic life support that enabled each agency's mission. For example, they provided the transport and security for over 500 of my missions outside of the wire. Secondly, they supported stability operations by conducting joint patrols with Afghan security forces, running a Hearts and Minds campaign through the civil affairs team that included everything from meeting village leaders, identifying how the government could be more effective or legitimate in the area, and then helping the government take action to win the population's support. And finally, the military commander of the PRT unified the various Afghan security elements that 2 years previously were shooting at each other. He was the primary liaison between all of the U.S. military actors in the area and the Afghan government, and then also approved all the military-funded projects. Some examples of how my PRT achieved our mission included: we helped facilitate the presidential and parliamentary elections, we supported the Afghan security forces during the 2005 riots, we employed upwards of 20,000 people per day as part of a counter-narcotics effort, and working with the provincial government, we identified fence-setting villages, funded projects to win the population's support for the Afghan government, and that actually resulted in blocking key smuggling routes through the Tora Bora Mountains that stopped the Taliban's resupply efforts. So what worked well? First, each agency were co-equal partners in the command group. There was not one leadership component. That actually helped negate a lot of the ego issues or personality issues that take place in PRTs and allowed us to work as real partners in the team. Second, a flexible fund controlled by the PRT for stability operations allows us folks at the tactical level to address the immediate needs that could, become larger problems if left unaddressed. Third, fully integrating the Afghan government in all of our decision making. Fourth, civil-military integration at the brigade, division, and corps command levels. And finally, having dedicated force protection to support each of our agency's missions. There were also challenges, most of which arose from a lack of clear policy. And the first two I discussed today really do need immediate action. First is the Commander's Emergency Response Program, or CERP funds. The military has taken on the Development and Reconstruction mission by default for two reasons. There's no similar flexible funding mechanism for USAID. I'm glad to hear that it's happening in Iraq now, but there's not in Afghanistan. Secondly, CERP cannot be used for security programming in Afghanistan because all the funds are managed by the U.S. military in Kabul, and this often leaves local security needs unmet in the short term. There must be a better alignment of mission and resources at a PRT level. The military supports security sector reform, USAID supports reconstruction and development, yet neither have funding mechanisms that are appropriate to do those jobs. And this also really confused Afghans and aid agencies who didn't understand why the military part of a PRT was building schools and clinics when the local police had no uniforms, vehicles, or facilities. The second main issue is the need for clarity on how the U.S. wants to deliver technical assistance. Calls for USDA, HHS, or education to send staff to PRTs so they can provide direct technical assistance denotes a major policy shift, because currently USAID outsources all of those responsibilities to a development industry. Shifting from outsourcing to direct implementation is not only a major policy change, but will require greater force protection requirements from the military and needs serious discussion. Other challenges that are not as critical on the policy front this moment include better integration of PRT and warfighting missions. The command group needs to be included in all planning combat operations in the province. And finally, we need a lot more civil affairs alpha teams out there because they are the only part of the PRT dedicated to working outside of the provincial capital. They're our eyes and ears. So to reiterate, two critical policy decisions that need immediate action are aligning CERP to the mission. It's very, very useful and needs to focus on security sector initiatives once a flexible fund is created for USAID. In the interim, CERP should continue to address both security and development, but with greater input for the development side. And second, clarifying how the U.S. wants to deliver technical assistance. So to end on a personal note, honestly, I've never seen interagency coordination work as well as it did in my PRT. Jalalabad was known as the best PRT because of how myself and my partners came together to overcome those issues I just described. And hopefully with your assistance, that program will be made even better. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. Mr. Barton.
Great, thank you very much, Congressman Snyder, Congressman Aiken, fellow members. Thank you. Rather than go through my written testimony, I'd like to just make a few remarks that I think complement the remarks that both Michelle and Ginger have made, and really that bring forward three larger challenges that the U.S. government and our Department of Defense face as they look at these transition cases. Just to quickly summarize what I said in my written testimony, I essentially have described PRTs as useful innovations that should be seen as works in progress, and that we should have very modest expectations for what they're going to do. They're not transformative as presently structured in any of these places. The arrival of PRTs in Iraq is probably too late to be of much value, and their presence in Afghanistan may lack the critical mass to make a difference. So we have a problem. On the other hand, they're important, and if we're going to get it right at any time in the future, it's valuable to get it right now. The three major challenges that I'd like to talk about first is that we still need to provide security and public safety in most of these places. That is job number one. And if you don't do that, that is the precondition for any other kind of progress. We have not done that in any of these cases that we're talking about today. And as a result, these experiments are really on the margins. If you don't establish a new order at the very beginning, without violence or intimidation, then it's going to be very difficult to find friends, allies, or expect the sort of movement, freedom of movement on the part of people that's going to really make a difference on the ground. The second major challenge is that we need to correct our asymmetric imbalance between U.S. military and civilian capacity. I think both of my colleagues have mentioned it in their statements as well, but it's way out of balance and it's not getting any better. So to imagine coordination and integration, which is really what you have to have, coordination is desirable, integration is absolutely necessary. It's just not possible as presently structured. That is further weakened by sort of the efforts that we make on something like a PRT. I don't believe that PRTs are yet as important to state, AID, or the Defense Department as they need to be if they're really going to be effective. You just don't do very many things that well if it's the 15th or 25th thing on your list. And so they're still operating as a sideshow. There's not the critical mass that we need. There are vacancies. The training stinks. The best people are not necessarily chosen. Promotions don't result from serving in these places. They don't get the money. There are a lot of signs that we're not sincere about what we're saying and what we're doing. And if you don't have that consistency, you're not going to perform. The third major challenge is that all initiatives in this conflict transition period have to put the people of the place first. The people of the place first. It's not about the United States, it's about actually the Afghans or the Iraqis. That also runs up against dominant cultures of our institutions. And so, you know, the U.S. Department of Defense is very good at getting things done, moving from point A to point B. It's many times more important to have a very rich process rather than to build the school. It's more important to actually have the people of the community say that they need a certain kind of school and that they're willing to work for it than to have us put it up for them. It's more important that completing projects isn't the end-all and be-all here. And oftentimes, the Department of Defense will revert to the war mode because that's job number one as opposed to the community job. So these are critical structural flaws that really will always stand in the way of the PRT. And when you look at the recommendations that I've offered, there's a considerable focus on where should they go and what should they look like and how can we make them function more smoothly. And pretty much everything that I said is highly complementary to what my colleagues have offered already. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation with you.
Thank you all. We will now begin our questioning. We go into the 5-minute rule, including Mr. Aiken and I. We put ourselves in the 5-minute rule. We will take those members that arrived were here before the gavel, and then we'll go to the members that arrived after the gavel. We've also been joined by Representative Kirsten Gillibrand, who will be allowed to question without objection at the conclusion of the members of the committee, and will be in the rotation. So if you'll start the clock, hopefully the clock will work. Ms. Cruz, you had in your written statement, I thought, was a kind of a good thumbnail, one-sentence summary of the kind of discussions that Jeff Davis and Mr. Aiken and others we've been talking about off and on for several months. And you say, quote, "The federal government," meaning our federal government, "the federal government as it is currently structured is not well suited to perform complex interagency missions in foreign lands." And I think that really is a good summary of the problem. Now the issue is then how do we get at this. I was, one of our former members of this committee who's no longer on this committee, Tom Allen from Maine, was in Iraq and Afghanistan in this last recess. We were talking not long ago about it, and he also has been a big believer in the need for more oversight, but he left the committee before we started the subcommittee. And his impression was that one of the problems that we're having with the PRTs, there's just been a lack of congressional oversight, that there were things that could have been done early on by us on this committee and in the Congress that would have helped things along. In your written statement, Ms. Cruz, you talk about perhaps we need a beyond Goldwater Nichols approach. Would you talk about some of the things that you see where Congress is going to have to step in and look at some of the things that we have done or need to do or have neglected?
SIGR has spent a lot of time in the last 3 years gathering information that we feel it is important to analyze and then provide back to the Congress broader recommendations on how to do this better. And one of the conclusions we always end up at is that the interagency process is not functioning well. Most of the problems that you will see in Iraq occur at the point where two agencies have to do something together. And because the funding is not worked, it's not singular sources of funding, whoever has the funding is the one that gets to make the decision. Because the lines of authority, the chain of command issues are not joined or coordinated, you very often have problems in the gap between one agency and the other. I can tell you that our organization is working very hard on a capping lessons learned that will take the Beyond Goldwater Nichols suggestion that we had in our third lessons learned report on program management. And we're going to try and more fully develop some suggestions for the Congress on ways that they could address that. But fundamentally, it's the way that the U.S. government is organized today. It is not, in our opinion, organized to be able to carry out this type of a mission. At no point is there a single decision maker who can arbitrate between the various agencies that have very different views on what needs to occur. And when it comes to things like PRTs, like governance, in the case of Iraq, there's very much the need for a single pool of funding. I think, as Michelle pointed out, I think that was a great point that we are looking at as well. There's a need for a coordinated line of authority that will distinguish between the Department of Defense's priorities and the international development priorities in an area and be able to make decisions that consider both. There are some major changes that Congress will need to look at. There's a lot of discussion on Beyond Goldwater Nichols that CSIS has participated very heavily in. And the Congress has talked a lot about this. There's a lot of efforts out there now, both at the Department of Defense and Department of State. The coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at the State Department and Department of Defense Directive 3000.05 begins to look at that. But in our view, there's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of words on paper, but until we can actually come up with a structure that can supplant the stovepiped way in which DoD and state and USAID operate, we will not be able to overcome the systemic challenges. And it's purely because of the effort of individuals who get it and are able to work with each other that this program is even functioning.
Do either of you have any comment about Congress's role in this?
Yeah, I think you have a very dynamic opportunity because there's so many flaws in the existing system. First off, it starts with the leadership. It's amazing that within our government, there are probably not 5 or 10 people that have been designated, been given the opportunity, or have been trained or prepared in any way to provide the leadership on the ground in these kinds of situations. We have a space program that if we were to say to the American people, I found somebody on the street 2 weeks ago and I've put him in the capsule and he's going to be going up, he or she is going to be going up for the next 10 days, the American public would be shocked. And yet that's how we've recruited our top leadership in these countries, our top non-military leadership in these countries. It's absurd. There should be people who have the opportunity to prepare themselves and think about a place like Pakistan for the next year and a half in case something were to really go wrong. Maybe we should have competing teams. It would probably cost us 50 people from all of the U.S. government that we would put aside and put them into that kind of situation where they'd actually be prepared. Now Jerry Bremer actually knows what he's doing. He might be of value. That was not the case when he was recruited for the job that he was put into. He'd never had that that experience before. So we're doing things that are patently foolish and wouldn't be tested and wouldn't be tried in any other part of our government. It certainly wouldn't be put to our public that way. The funding issues, the same idea. We have to have clarity of funding. We have to have much clearer authority. The problem is much deeper than just between departments. If you go into the State Department, or if you went into AID, or if you went into the Defense Department, you could have some really good internal warfare right there. In fact, when we have the State Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, and that office isn't even given license to operate in a couple parts of the world yet because the geographic bureaus are resisting it. That happens as well in the Pentagon. So these are the kinds of things. If you call forward and you test the people on them, and you say we're not going to stand for this, generally inside of the bureaucracy, if one congressperson or one or two staffers get interested in something, there's a tremendous amount of responsiveness. People think the entire Hill is mobilized to take on the issue. So I would say you have real opportunities, and they are part of a national tragedy that those of us who've worked in this field, have seen for the last few years, and it's really, it's deeply unfortunate.
Mr. Aiken.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder. Just proceeding along the same lines, it seems that some of the lessons that we're learning, perhaps the hard way, over in Iraq, are things that we could have remembered from our own history. If we take a look at how America was built, it wasn't built by starting in Washington, D.C. It was built by little towns and communities that came together, 13 states and all. And it appears that our greater successes, at least from what we're hearing, are happening more with the local governments and our breakthroughs by having enough troop strength to be able to be a significant positive influence in building local communities together. And the model that suggests itself was the federalism that a lot of us have been talking about but didn't quite know how to get it going. That being the case, the thing that seemed a little consistent of your testimonies and that seems to raise a question is that particularly, Ms. Cruz, your comments, you gave us a whole list of all the reasons why it won't work and said, yeah, but we're doing pretty good, all things considered. What is your sense of your ability to contribute to the building of the local towns and governments and developing some sense of structure and organization in Iraq? Do the PRTs contribute to that, or is it just something that the tremendous extra resources that the military brings to bear, are they the main player there, or what is your niche, and how is your niche different than what military commanders would be doing?
Just for clarification, our organization provides oversight of the program people who actually do the work. So we're sort of the independent view of what they are doing. From what we have seen in the field, it's very true. We did point out that there's a lot of problems and it's not going very well, but for all of that, there is progress. There's progress that you can point to in just about every area. The provinces have developed basic capacity to govern at the local level. That's a general statement. It varies widely from province to province. The more developed provinces don't have that issue. When you talk about Kurdistan, they have no issues. But when you start to go down south, some of the smaller provinces do have issues. But the PRTs, and I have to sort of commingle the two things, the PRTs and the military presence in the area, both working their own areas and working together, have had a palatable effect on the ability to govern in these areas. We'll have some specifics on it in the audit that we're going to release in 2 weeks. But from what I have seen, there was no local government. It was a very centralized, Saddam Hussein-controlled government. And in the intervening time, these local provincial councils have started to get engaged. They're talking about putting together plans for what they need to do in their communities. They're having discussions. There are major sectarian divisions that have to be overcome in some of these areas, and that's hindering progress. And one of the biggest problems is there still is not a provincial powers law, which in fact gives these local governments any clarity on what it is they're supposed to do. So in some cases, there's the seeds of democracy have been planted, and they're beginning to talk, but they're not yet able to say, I have the ability to direct reconstruction programs to occur or to direct the chief of police in my area. So there has been progress. It's come a long way from a full stop. There was no local government, and now there are the beginnings of local government. But there's a very long, very difficult road ahead, and whether they're going to be able to actually coalesce into governments that are able to provide the basic functions and the essential services for their citizens, I don't know if that's going to happen.
Are we waiting for Baghdad to basically give them that authority, or can we at the local level, working through the military, say, okay, we're designating you, you're going to take care of police, and you're going to do education, and you're going to do health care, and this is a local issue, and just take over and take charge? Do we have the authority to do that, or are we still kind of waiting for Baghdad to?
It is dependent on the Iraq Council of Representatives to give them the legal authority to be able to run their own affairs. And we're talking the Iraqis in this case. And everything that the PRTs do is trying to assist the Iraqi authorities in getting clarity in what it is they're supposed to do. But we are hamstrung by the pace of the Iraq Council of Representatives. Until they pass that clarifying legislation, these local governments do not have the authority yet to take action.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, please.
Because this mirrors the situation in Afghanistan. When I got there, there was no government. There was a transitional government, and yet we were there trying to do reconstruction and align it with a Ministry of Education plan that didn't exist. So PRTs are actually there to help facilitate this very ambiguous, opaque time that we're waiting for the local government to develop and to build these rules and regulations. And as Rick said, it matters because it's their government. So we have to somehow push it along, but not push it too much that we get the cart before the horse. And it's a very difficult thing to manage, and that's why you do see progress, but you also see a lot of these problems.
Mrs. Davis.
I think just one quick comment, if I could. There's tremendous local opportunity, oftentimes much greater local opportunity than there is central government opportunity. But we tend to come in as a federal government, and we tend to look for counterparts. And we were just having a little conversation here before the hearing began, and we said, how long would it take to get a really good, competent, new, say, part of government working in Washington? And the consensus answer was maybe the Department of Homeland Security, 10 years. Well, what is it about Kabul and Baghdad that makes it easier to do that there? And so you really have to go where the opportunities present themselves. They do present themselves in a very rich mix, not always a local mayor, not always a decent governor, but almost always some kind of citizen group. This is, and the creative people, whether they're lieutenant colonels in south of Baghdad or whether they're AID workers in Afghanistan, tend to find them. And so we have an entrepreneurial tradition here of finding them. But what you then have to get to is critical mass, and how do you get enough of it going that you really feel that it has a transformative effect. Even though you're really there as a catalyst, you're not there as the owner, you're not there as a colonial power, and these are very fine lines, which I think oftentimes get a little bit confused by sort of the military tradition of you're in there, you're in charge, and that's not really what's happening in this transition phase.
Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I'm really glad that we're talking about this today, and I know that all of my colleagues have, in one time or another, had a real interest. Could we go back just a little bit? Because I know you're talking about, extenuating circumstances. Certainly Iraq, Afghanistan have a very different approach and response in many ways. But I want to just go back to building the skill sets that are required to do this. If we think about, where do we want to be, 15 years from now, perhaps, and training the next generation of people. One of the things that has really stuck with me, when we were talking about avian flu issues a while back, when a few of us were involved in that and working with the State Department and DOD and some other folks, the image of basically a State Department kindergartner working with a doctoral person from the military was suggested, that here you have, it's that asymmetrical kind of relationship, because the military people are trained over a period of multiple assignments and posts so that those skills begin to develop. But it seems to me we don't have anything even comparable to that exactly in the State Department. USAID, perhaps, I had a chance to look at a few USAID programs in Africa over the break and in several countries, and trying to think how do you bring that together? I mean, it's nation building skills, I guess, but where you know, where are these skill sets? I mean, how do we incentivize young people to think not so much perhaps I want to go into the military someday, of course we want to encourage that, but what is it that brings young people today to say, I want to be part of that kind of an effort somewhere? Is that important? Is that relevant? How do we begin to do that? I know that we want to leap ahead, to today and how we do these PRTs, but I also think we need to step back a little bit. How do we develop that?
Well, if I could start on this, I had the good fortune to start an office in the USAID that was called the Office of Transition Initiatives, and we found that there was no shortage of Americans and international partners who wanted to do precisely this work. And I would say that it's probably the most desirable place now to work inside of AID, because people see this as important work that they would like to have an opportunity to do, and that there was some flexibility that Congress had provided notwithstanding authority, so that there was the same kind of opportunity that you have in humanitarian disasters to deal with these kinds of complex cases. On the other hand, it's a very limited operation. It is a boutique, and we're in the mega mall world right now. So what's the advantage of the United States having had created probably the most innovative little office that doesn't have the ability to do very much? It hasn't taken hold. Now, what I've seen over the last couple of years is, as we've come to a realization that our intelligence community doesn't have the talent it needs, the intelligence community is recruiting a lot of young people, a tremendous number of young people. So jobs are provided inside of our intelligence service to do this kind of work. But I've had a chance over the last few months to do a listening tour here in the United States. And one of the questions I've asked almost every audience I've been with, I've said, if you had a choice, you were running the State Department, and you had a choice of spending $500 million to build a new embassy in Baghdad, or $500 million to train just 500 Americans to be language capable, to operate skillfully on the ground in a place like Iraq, which would you choose? Out of 500 or so Americans that I've asked that question of, only 2 have said the embassy. When I asked them, which one do you think the U.S. government did, all 500 people have said the embassy. So, and by the way, since I started asking the question, the price of the embassy went up to $600 million. So we are not making critical choices, and that's exactly what the Congress can help direct. But people will say, well, no, we have the money to do that, and if we're going to have an embassy, it's got to be secure. Almost all Americans know we have to be more skilled. When you read Ginger's testimony, she describes how few people are language capable and how dependent we are on people whose lives we then put at risk by asking them to help us with language. And it's just, I mean, these are the kinds of things that just are way out of balance. And every audience that whether it was at Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, or the University of Iowa in Iowa City, they came to the same conclusion. So what's keeping us from reaching those kinds of conclusions?
I'll just be real quick. The other issue is that there's a number of young people who desperately want to go out and do it, but simply don't have the time and field to get the jobs. A number of my friends from just finishing graduate school are dying to get out to Iraq and Afghanistan and serve their countries in a civilian capacity, but they haven't had the 3 years of experience. I don't even know if I could get a PRT job now, having had the experience going into it originally. So when you're looking at this, sometimes there's unrealistic expectations. So we also need to design a program to recruit very talented people that may just not have the perfect skills, put them into a 6-month or year-long training and bring them out. There needs to be some kind of middle ground as well.
Dr. Gingrich.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I want to thank all of our witnesses. I must say, I'm sitting here getting a little discouraged on your testimony in regard to the effectiveness of the PRTs, and I know that the chairman, maybe it was a ranking member, asked about what Congress could do or what we should be doing or what oversight. To be honest with you, I would guess that outside of the House Armed Services Committee, there are not too many members of the House that know a whole lot about PRTs and may not even understand what the initials stand for. It's been a good hearing, though, and we appreciate the information that you're bringing to us, albeit, again, I say a little discouraging. Let me just ask a couple of specific questions, and any one of the three in any order, it's fine. In regard to the embedded PRTs, I don't fully understand the difference, except I guess in the number of personnel involved in a regular PRT and an embedded PRT. But tell me this: I'd like to know about the command and control relationship of the embedded PRTs within a brigade combat team. And the other question is somewhat interrelated. Is there an overall PRT coordinator in the Department of Defense that interfaces with the State Department? If there's not, should there be? Because it just seems to me that in your testimony that you talk about a bunch of Keystone cops or something. So I don't, you go ahead and address those two questions.
I will. Thank you very much, sir. An embedded PRT differs from a primary PRT in that the leader of an embedded PRT is the brigade commander. So the military is the one that directs the work of the embedded PRT. And right now, as it's structured, there's 4 people that staff that: a Department of State employee, a civil affairs person, a bilingual bicultural advisor who speaks the language, and a civil affairs officer. But the direction comes from the brigade commander, so it's very military directed. The primary PRTs are led by the Department of State. So very often it is a foreign service officer who will lead the primary PRTs, and they will interact with the brigade commanders, but they are the ones who make the call on what the PRTs do. And they have about 100 staff on average, whereas an EPRT has a smaller area of operation, and it's usually 4 people.
Do you ever have the 2 in the same area of responsibility?
No, you don't. The PRTs each have a unique area that they will have responsibility
So
for.
you wouldn't find a PRT in an embedded
No.
PRT team in the same
No,
area?
you would not. And then on the command and control structure, you are absolutely right. I think I alluded to that in my testimony. I was not as clear as we would like to be. The overall lead for the PRT program is a Department of State individual who leads the Office of Provincial Affairs. As it's currently structured, there is no high-level MNFI representative that coordinates with the State Department lead of the program. Now, there is extensive interaction all the way through the organization. Brigade commanders and corps officials are very involved. Civil affairs is very involved. So all the way through the structure, there's a lot of lashing up. But when you get to the top, there is not a high-level person on the military side that sits at the right hand of the person who leads the PRT program, who at the moment is an ambassadorial level position within the embassy. So that is an area that we think could be improved, because while the coordination works in the field, when it comes time to make those interagency connections and to work policy that reflects both the military and the civilian needs, that policy is pretty much decided at the Department of State level and lacks that high-level military interaction.
Yeah. Ms. Parker.
In Afghanistan, we have something called the Executive Steering Committee, that it has every ambassador from a troop-contributing nation together with the Minister of Interior for Afghanistan, because PRTs fall under the Ministry of Interior for the Afghanistan, for the Afghan government. So what you have is every 2 months we have a meeting where all the leadership comes together and creates policy. This is where the ISAF PRT handbook was created. This is where a number of the initial terms of reference were created, and determining what the PRT should be focusing on. For example, should they be supporting counter-narcotics? This is very contentious in German PRTs and Italian PRTs. So that's where all those issues get worked out. And then there's a sub-working group of folks like me that would go on a weekly basis and try to hammer out these issues and prepare our ambassadors for this larger meeting. Within the U.S. government, state aid and DOD each had their own PRT coordinating office, and they met on a weekly basis.
Mr. Barton.
Just quickly on the discouraging side, I don't think any of us want to be discouraging. I think that we believe that these PRTs have value, that they've had an effect, that they're probably the right idea. The larger problems in Iraq and Afghanistan limit how successful they're going to be. That's my greater concern. And so they're terrific in terms of extending America and its allies' reach into places, its presence, its connections, the insights about these They can be agile, they're catalytic. Those are the strengths. But they also have had a lot of other problems that are really larger than the PRT problems, but they happen to show up rather clearly in the PRT case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
We will now recognize members who arrived after the gavel began the meeting in the order in which they arrived, and first will be Mr. Davis, followed by Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I'd like to point out, this is an issue that many of us on the committee and in the Congress have a tremendous amount of interest in. We're going to be coming to you separately. Congresswoman Davis and I are forming an interagency reform caucus or a national security reform caucus to talk about ways to make the changes that are necessary in the long term. Just reading through the State Department job descriptions on the website, having worked in the consulting world and also overseas in the peacekeeping business, many of it are non-starters because of the need for entrepreneurial personalities. And I think the State Department culture, quite frankly, perhaps at one time it fit the needs of the country, but I don't think it does right now. And I share Ms. Parker's point of view, having seen many young people who are desperate to get to the field but can't get to the field, are willing to learn on the ground and do what I think is most important for the long term, is build long-term personal relationships with people in these regions that transcend just about everything to get things done. One of the comments, I'd like to start with the Afghanistan model, having wandered around there a little bit and then move over to Iraq. What do you think, speaking from your position and experience, is necessary legislative reform to make this work, to come up with the expeditionary type of environment or group that we need in the long run? I would go probably a little bit beyond Mr. Barton's view, is we don't need just 50 people, but almost in my sense would be, in order to move to the diplomatic level, I know many people have this desire to get to the ambassadorial level, that perhaps they've got to spend a significant portion of their lives really doing something as opposed to going to cocktail parties. And the one thing I think that said many of my colleagues from the military who found themselves running areas of expertise in PRTs, for example, one who ran agricultural programs at one point in Afghanistan, who had absolutely no farming experience whatsoever, but she was a tremendously motivated officer in terms of coming up with creative solutions and understanding some of the cultural issues. I'd like your thoughts on where we go with this from a personnel policy standpoint, and really what, if you could be the dictator for a day, what you would come up with.
Well, first I would calm down all of the agencies and say we're not going to completely revamp who you are. I think there's a big fear, I can speak from USAID, that the entire agency's foundation is going to change and suddenly we're going to be fighting a war. Because a lot of people join USAID because they're humanitarians and they want to help people. So I think that first we need to say we're not going to radically change the existing bureaucratic structures that are there. But what I would offer is that we need to create a new bureaucratic structure of some kind that combines all of these efforts of the 3 Ds, if you will.
Are you saying flattening out the existing structures to accommodate that?
Well, I would say cutting off pieces of it, or it sounds a little too violent, but like what he was saying with OTI, expanding the concept of OTI,
that can be a humanitarian gesture if you want to save the patient. So
I've been in Afghanistan too long. But we need something in which you can take Directive 3000.05, you can take what's being done in OTI, you can take SCRS and join them together. For me, the natural fit would be in the National NSC. That seems to be the coordinating body or structure that should be doing a lot of this stuff. Now, I don't know if bureaucratically if that makes sense, but I would say bring those different elements together and form something specific to this kind of war, because it doesn't need to change the whole foundation of aid or the State Department. Drinking cocktails is a very important part of everyone's job, but it isn't necessarily for this mission that's taking place at this point in time. So I would just caution it that it doesn't need to be radical, but maybe just taking the strengths of each one to create that unity of effort that you mentioned.
Do you think having and I'll throw this open to the group, having an empowered deputy secretary in all of the agencies who can speak for the secretary of for interagency operations or coordination would be helpful? The reason I'm asking the question is, when you get out into the field and boots on the ground, as long as the personalities were reasonably compatible, they could do great things.
Yeah.
And typically, as with, they're not unlike corporate turnarounds, it's the middle management that becomes more problematic, dealing with that aspect of the bureaucracy.
I'm not sure that I would move in that direction, but I can give you a couple other suggestions that you might take into consideration. I think the concept of the Civilian Reserve Corps that it's now being promoted by the State Department's Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization has potential. It could be a step in the right direction. There are tens of thousands of Americans who like doing this kind of work, and they find a way to do it, whether they're young or old or whatever. And we have to know those folks better. The State Department nor AID, actually, there's really no part of the U.S. government that's really a good executive recruiter. It's done pretty much on an occasional basis. So you have to set up something that has a reserve quality to it that gives you the quick response capability. But then we also have to think well beyond Americans in these jobs, and we have to recognize that to get the kinds of people that you want in the right place, the right time, with the right skill sets, it may well be an international, a global recruiting effort. That's what we did initially in Haiti in 1994. And it's because we had been informed by what had happened to us in Rwanda in 1994, and that is that there were not enough human rights experts who wanted to go into Rwanda after a genocide to serve as human rights monitors. So you had to expand the search right away and work on 3-month contracts. I mean, that's sort of the way we create these jobs. So I'd do that. I would think about a wars. The wars are concept at the NSA is not a bad one. There probably should be a national security advisor for these kinds of cases, as opposed to expecting that our national security advisor can go from dealing with North Korea and Iran and then is going to worry about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in the afternoon. It just doesn't happen. Human beings cannot multitask these sorts of complex matters successfully. Expand the offices that are working, which I think is what Michelle was suggesting, and then really get agreement at the top. The Dutch model is that the 3 key ministers, defense, development, and foreign affairs, they are the triumvirate that manages what they are doing in Afghanistan. Now, when our two cabinet officers, defense and state, showed up in Iraq together at one point, it was hailed there as the first arrival of the unity government that we were arguing for here in this country. So anyway, we can see that we have big problems at a lot of different levels here, and I think it has to be a little bit more radical. It doesn't require a whole reorganization, but I would say that AID could focus on this work in much greater basis than it is. At least 30% of AID should be focused on this rather than treating these things as if they're one-offs, which is also, by the way, the way the Defense Department and the State Department are treating these events, even though this is what we've been doing for the last 14 years.
Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses. You mentioned the Dutch example. Are there other lessons we can learn from other nationalities and PRTs?
There are. Actually, DFID has a model which we have been studying as we're looking at making recommendations to the Congress. And the DFID, the example of the United Kingdom actually provides some possible ways that we could move. One of them is
DFID, I'm sorry.
DFID, I'm sorry, is the corollary to USAID in the British government.
I'm sorry.
And what they do is, right now, USAID is subordinate in our government to the Department of State, so we essentially have state and defense that work together. In the government of the United Kingdom, they actually have 3 cabinet-level agencies, which would be the corollaries to our Department of Defense, USAID, and Department of State. And one of the things that they have done is create something called conflict pools. So when there is funding that is designed to do relief and reconstruction work, rather than that funding going to Department of Defense or Department of State, which is the beginning of a lot of coordination challenges, that money is put into one fund, and then it has to be jointly decided upon by the 3 agencies. They've had limited success. There are challenges to it, but it is one of the models, I think, that could be looked at that we might want to consider.
And the Danish also have the same thing in Afghanistan, where if it's a small pool of money, the military can directly fund it. If it's anything over, I think, $20,000, the development person must be involved, and then the development person also has their own fund. So there's 3 separate funds that all are operating out of the PRT, and we found that that was quite successful.
Even Singapore has its own little contribution that it's making in Bamiyan in Afghanistan, and they have done a particularly good job probably of figuring out what the needs of the place were before they offered the solution.
It's humbling to be bested by these little bitty countries. How about individual training, the skill set that individual foreign workers bring? Are they trained? You mentioned the NASA example. We wouldn't send anyone into space. Are these foreign aid workers better trained, language or otherwise?
I think it's a mix. I mean, I don't know of any place. I know the British, at least reportedly to me, the British are doing a much better job of preparing the people that are going out to the PRTs, whether they are better, whether they arrive with greater skill sets or not, I'm not sure. But at least the concept of training. I had a call this morning from NPR, and they're doing a story on the training. And the U.S. training now for State Department people is somewhere between a week and 2 weeks for a PRT, and much of the training is on security and personal safety. That's probably not going to be adequate for the complexity of these things. We found when we were hiring people, because I set up operations like this in about 15 different countries over about a 6-year period in the 1990s. And I felt that there were 3 critical skills that needed to be apparent in anybody you put on the ground. One is they had to be sort of political organizers. They had to be community organizers. A second, they had to be extremely comfortable living in a place like a Peace Corps person. And the third, they had to have the edge of a military or humanitarian worker of just doing it. Lives have to be saved. We got to take action. So those 3 skill sets I could almost never find in a single individual. So what you ended up doing is you'd hire 2 people that you'd hope would cover the 3 skill sets, and that the cultures they came from wouldn't be in conflict with each other. The opportunity is there. There are a zillion Americans who have these abilities and the desire to get on with this kind of work. Many of them are out there as missionaries or as jazz pianists or whatever it happens to be. You run into the oddest combination of Americans everywhere. So I believe we could do it here, but it's not that we're not giving them the guidance that we need from here.
A couple of other things to point out is one of the problems that we have is security clearances. A lot of the times that the people that need to work at a PRT need to have security clearances. Well, the people who can get security clearances are generally the ones from the United States that have never traveled outside of the country and that have very little ability to speak another language, which is not what you need. Only 29 out of the 810 spots right now for PRTs are bilingual bicultural advisors who can speak Arabic and understand the Iraqi culture.
I saw that in your testimony. I also saw that we're 200 State Department people short. Someone mentioned that the lack of career preferment if you take these jobs, but what about basic pay? What did you make, Ms. Parker, when you were in Afghanistan?
My last job, I was a GS-14, step 4.
I think part of the problem is the culture. One of the things that I was told that was very shocking, a junior foreign service officer that I spoke to just last week at the Baghdad PRT told me that he was very interested in the Middle East. He had just started working in this area. He had Spanish and French as 2 languages, and he had just come on as a junior foreign service officer, and so he was asking the State Department if he could be trained in Arabic because he was very interested in the work that he was doing. And he was told they would not train him in Arabic because if he was trained in 3 languages, he would have an unfair advantage over other individuals in the Foreign Service, and that would cause an imbalance in the system, which I found to be an interesting point.
That's why we don't offer language training to members of Congress. Cause an imbalance. Mr. Johnson.
Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about money. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The contract civilian employees employed on the PRTs, are they necessary? And if so, why?
Well, I was one, so I think I was necessary. USAID has a hiring mechanism called a personal service contract, in which USAID hires me directly. I was not in the Foreign Service. And basically I can give a 2-week notice and quit. But I directly worked for USAID, and I got all the benefits, diplomatic passport, you name it. That is a critical function, and I think that's part of why USAID has been able to staff differently than the State Department, who requires drawing it from their own resources. The other contract employees that you might be talking about from, the local nationals, or whom?
What roles do the other contract employees fill on the PRT?
Well, we had contracted interpreters that were hired through a mechanism, and there's good and bad with that. I found that having a local who actually knew what was going on and knew the political environment was a little more useful than necessarily having someone with a security clearance, but I wasn't doing security cleared required work. The other contracted employees we had was Dynacorps police trainers, and that was really useful because the police program was not particularly well coordinated with our PRT, and so by having those contracted employees living on the base, it helped with coordination.
In the case of Iraq, there are very few contract employees relative to the overall effort. In the case of State Department and Department of Defense, they use their own employees, or else they use 3161 hiring authority, which allows them to hire temporary federal employees. In the case of translators and some of the other bilingual bicultural advisors, they do use contracting mechanisms, but most of the individuals that staff the Iraq PRTs are either temporary federal hires or else are employees of the various agencies.
I don't think you could possibly do the work out there unless you had personal services contractors as well as some private contracting. There just isn't a pool of talent in the U.S. government to even get started on these jobs as presently set up. And just on the security clearance thing, we have to take a huge review of that. It's absurd. One of my very best people working in the Balkans, I knew he'd been arrested for civil disobedience. I liked that quality. He had been outside of the governor's office in Alaska, and he had been causing a lot of problems. And we were taking on Milosevic in Serbia, and he struck me as if that was about as good a credential as I could come up with. And after we did the FBI security check on him, 6 weeks later they came back and told me that he'd been arrested for civil disobedience. And I said, well, we already knew that. And in fact, this is exactly why we were hiring the guy. So we've got to change this model. It's costing a lot of money. It's taking a lot of time. It's not getting us the candidates we need, and it's putting us in second place.
So now in Iraq, where the PRTs are commanded by military personnel, correct, versus Afghanistan, where it's State Department?
The EPRTs, no, actually Iraq has both models. Iraq is sort of a conglomeration of several different approaches, so it's very unclear, and I apologize. It's difficult to explain because it's confusing to the people who actually run it. The main PRTs are run by a State Department lead, and the embedded PRTs are run by a military lead.
In both circumstances, as well as in Afghanistan, who makes the decisions as to who to hire from a private employee standpoint?
In Afghanistan, it really depends. For example, the embassy contracted the DynCorp folks who were doing the police training. So that was an embassy decision, and they made a deal to have them live at the PRTs versus on some, secure house in the city. Whereas the military had a fund to hire local nationals, and I did as well as USAID. So it's really a mixed bag.
In the case of Iraq, the decision to hire primarily rests with the Department of State, which has gone out, cast a very wide net, and tried to get as many people as they could with a match in skill sets. And then what they do is the secondary screen would be the PRT leaders, who are usually State Department folks at the primary PRTs, would then screen and say what types of skill sets they wanted. So if they needed more agricultural advisors or if they needed economists, that would be the type of person that they would look for, and then they would be able to hopefully pick people that would be a better match for their PRT.
Let me ask this question. Do the civilian contract employees get paid from any of the QIP funds or CERP funds or the local government and community development program funds? Do any of those funds go to any of the contract employees?
They do not.
And are they paid through the, is there some other pot of money that the PRT commanders, if you will, control that pays the civilian employees?
It's more of an O&M budget issue for the Department of State, and that's one of the limiting factors because they don't have sufficient funds to really be able to hire, I think, as many contracted employees as they would like. So one of the limiting factors in their being able to bring on more contractors at the State Department is the limitation in the amount of funds that they have to hire people to staff the PRTs. All of the money right now that's appropriated through the supplemental and through the main State Department is for actual program work and for not only for projects, but for the operations of the PRT. A lot of the staff it's hard to nail down where the money is coming from because the State Department eats the salaries and the contract funds within their operational budgets.
We'll go to another round here if you've got the stamina for it, so we'll start the clock again. I wanted to ask, I think I'll address this question to you, Mr. Barton, and I've got questions for Ms. Cruz and Ms. Parker, but some years ago I had to have heart surgery, and the surgeon that did the work was one of these guys. He had 2 rooms open at any one time, had complete surgical teams in there, and he'd go to one room and he'd do his little thing. He'd go in the other room and they'd have it all opened up, and he'd do that little thing in there, and then the other teams would be closing and they'd clear that out. So my question is this: are the PRTs, are they or ought they be, or should they be like that surgeon that has all this support going on, like our military, in which the military does all this work at great risk, personal risk, to get the PRTs in there to do their work? Or are they similar to the person that when I get back to the room, deliver the flowers to my room? Do you understand what I'm saying? Are they ultimately what this is all about in terms of the military activity to get our folks there, or should they be?
I'm not sure that I do understand the way you structured the question.
Well, what I mean is we have all this military activity.
Yeah.
Should we, in terms of how we think about this, should we think in terms of the whole purpose of this military activity is provide enough security so that our PRTs can operate, or should we consider them, it's like a bonus?
Yeah. I believe that the primary responsibility of the military is to establish a new security and public safety order. That's their primary responsibility. They have to do that. Then ideas like the PRTs or NGO activity or other kinds of things can flower in that kind of environment. But if you don't take care of that first piece, then you have to make your PRT something that's really has a heavy security component, and what you're trying to do is do development work in places that you still have almost war going on. I happen to think that's the value of the PRT model as opposed to the NGOs and everybody else out there, that they can operate in that semi-dangerous or even dangerous environment, whereas you don't really want to expose your entire civilian capacity.
What you discuss in your written statement. Ms. Cruz.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. It probably wasn't the best question, but I'm trying to get at, because we hear the discussion, we'll hear it from General Petraeus. This war is not going to be solved militarily.
Yeah.
Okay, what's going to solve it?
It's not going to be it's not likely to be micro political activity. It's likely to be macro political activity.
Right, but the question is this part of what leads to, all politics is local?
It can be helpful, but then you need critical mass, and that's why we describe, well, we suggested in our paper on Afghanistan, as I've been in my testimony, is that you better go to the toughest places, and then you better have enough going on there that you can really make a difference. When I was asked to go and meet with the 1st Marines in Camp Pendleton, we basically told them a year and a half ago, you should have several of these PRTs in Al-Anbar province, and who cares what's going on up in the Kurdish areas, because you could have, anybody can go up there and work. So this isn't a military basing operation. This is actually using what you need in the place that you need it. You wouldn't have sent your surgeon in to another operating room where somebody was having an appendectomy, which is essentially what we've done in these places by not focusing them in the right spots.
Ms. Cruz, Mr. Cooper touched on this. You had mentioned that you thought things are much further along in terms of staffing than they were a year ago, and then they were when the report came out, the July 15th report. But it seems to me we still got a ways to go on this. I guess it was on page 8. When you talk about, your phrasing was, state and the civilian agencies have identified 68% of their surge staff slated to be in place by the end of the year.
Yes.
That seems abysmal. This is the 5th year of the war, but you're slated to be identified. You're still saying a third of them by the end of the year, 5 months from now, haven't even been identified. That's an abysmal. If this was the Iraqis that were doing this, we would say, David Walker this morning would have given them another big F-. It's abysmal. And it gets back to the question about the surgeon. We've got men and women that we all know that have gotten wounded or died, I think, to help these folks get out there and do the work. And somehow the State Department and all these other civilian agencies cannot get their act together. I mean, this is an abysmal failing record for this government. Now, am I right or wrong? You say 68% have identified.
It is a very major challenge for the Department of State. But again, if we look at the system, the way that the system is structured, it allows that to be the case. When you've got a State Department system that rewards different things, at the end of the day, everybody does something that's going to be in their best professional interest. I mean, I think that it goes for just about everybody in this room. And so if it's not in the professional interest of an individual within the Department of State, within their career path, to serve in a location such as Iraq, then you're not going to have those people volunteering for Iraq. I think there's been a lot of progress along that line. We've seen a lot of changes in the policies and in the statements in the State Department that if you serve in Iraq, that it will be viewed as something that will put you a step ahead of everybody else in your career path because you are making that sacrifice. But when you come right down to it, the military joins the Department of Defense knowing that they could be sent to war, knowing that they could die. People who join the State Department do not make those same choices when they join the State Department. And so there are family considerations, there's the personality considerations. These are not people who necessarily signed up 5-10 years ago in their career to do this.
You're giving explanations for the failure, but it's still a failure. I mean, maybe it's Mr. Aiken and my failure, I don't know, but it's a failure that this thing's been going on for 5 years, and we're still...
We agree.
Mr. Aiken.
Well, I don't think I have additional questions. I mean, I see a very big problem, but I don't know that I have specific questions for each of you, and I think we're all trying to get at it and trying to figure out how do you make that next step, and exactly how are those responsibilities defined, and how do you structure it, how do you make it work. And it is a sense of frustration, and that's been the thing we keep hearing after years of sitting in here taking testimony. We keep hearing that, well, the military is there to give us more time to do what, and who's doing it. That to do what and who's doing it piece just never quite seems to happen. I think we're getting there now, but I think, I mean, if I were king for a day over in Iraq, I think what I would do with the federal guys is say, look, you've got just 2 or 3 or 4 federal functions, and that's all you guys have to worry about. Everything else is going to be done at the local level, and you guys couldn't put the local elections together, so we'll take care of that for you. And we'd start calling those local elections in Anbar province and tell the guys in Anbar, look, here's the deal. You're going to run your own schools, your own hospitals, your own, and your own police station. This is your area, and you own it. And so let's get on with the operation, and then you basically create that federalism kind of thing, which they don't understand, but they have every reason to love once they get the hang of it. But we're just seeing this continuous, and some of it's because we've been in Washington, D.C. too long. We think the problems are going to be solved in Baghdad or in Washington, D.C. They're going to be solved in the local provinces, the local people solving their problems and putting the solutions together. And that, we need to get on with that, but it's hard to know structurally how do we, it's huge, and it's bad enough. Problem is that there are different committees within Congress that start this whole thing, and we have trouble just dealing with those, so it can be frustrating. But I don't have any questions.
I'll have a couple more here, and then we'll conclude. One of this issue about State Department, some years ago, I came back from a trip to Africa made by myself and visited with the ambassadors there. One was in Ethiopia and one was in Sierra Leone, I guess. I think that was that trip. And no, Ethiopia and Eritrea is where it was. And one of them was very frustrated with the inability to get the postings. I'm looking at you, Ms. Cruz, because you addressed this issue. The hardship post is in the State Department jargon. And we talked about it and thought, well, maybe a GAO study. Well, GAO got really good. They really got a hold of this. They sent teams out, I think, to China, to Saudi Arabia, and someplace else. All the ambassadors, these are all countries that had hardship posts, they opened the doors, told their staff, tell them anything they want to know. Maybe this will help us get our personnel policies right. And the one that was most striking to me was in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The public affairs person, whatever they call that, the public diplomacy person who's supposed to be giving the American message to that part of Saudi Arabia didn't speak Arabic. That was a requirement. I mean, it was a preferred requirement, but they didn't have anybody that would volunteer to go there. So but I don't fault that person. Here's some energetic, probably a Miss Parker type, who said, yeah, I'll pick up some Arabic. I'll work at it. I'm going to stay long enough. You know, maybe I'm single. I can study Arabic, and I'm going to try real hard. And so we're sitting here saying, gee, people don't have the right skill sets. The reality is we got some pretty tough people that are taking on challenges that those of us who, I'm a doctor, I could volunteer to go, who are trained, decide not to do. And that's, I think we need to be careful about, you know, being too hard on these folks, people that volunteer, because they are the ones who step forward because our system isn't working, you know, and I wouldn't want to come down negative on that. I was going to ask for your opinion on that, Ms. Parker, but I probably have set it up. One specific question I want to ask, and I think you talked about this, Ms. Cruz, as we're talking about, I mean, there really is some agreement, I think, in this country that something is going to change, probably coming in spring and beyond, that there will start to be a drawdown of troops. And I think you make a comment in your written statement, we better be careful how we do that we don't leave our PRT NGO types who are counting on the security to get their work done suddenly and gradually not in the secure environment that they thought they were. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I did not bring that up, and I was remiss in that. The PIC process, as it's called, Provincial Iraqi Control, is a very serious impediment to the PRTs being able to do their work, and yet we do not see any clear sign of coordination between the military decision makers who make the call on changing the footprint of the U.S. military in Iraq and the people who are trying to do the PRT work in the provinces. There is not good coordination on that process at all. And sometimes the statements are made that the military, for reasons of wanting to turn over portions of the country to Iraqi military control, they're saying, well, this will be good, we'll pick this province, and once that's done, then the PRTs will be able to come in and they can work on developing governance. Well, the problem is that PRT will most likely not be able to ever get in that province again to be able to have the meetings with the provincial governors. And that's the case right now in Najaf. That's the case in Kerbala. There are what's called PSTs, where they take individuals who have those PRT skills. They're sitting in Hilla.
What's the S?
The S is Provincial Support Teams, just another acronym. But these are individuals with the same mandate or ostensibly the same mission who are sitting right now in the PRT in Hilla, and they're unable to make phone calls, they have no visibility on the ground, and they're supposed to be developing that governance in Najaf, and Najaf right now is essentially a black hole. We don't know what's going on there. We don't know the ability of the government, and we don't know what the capability is to develop that going forward. And that's largely because we don't have a military presence any longer. And so as the military is looking at the PIC process and as they're closing down forward operating bases, the cost implications, the presence shift between having a coalition force there and not having a coalition force there has a massive impact on whether a PRT can perform its mission. We're going to look at that a little bit more in our audit that's coming out in 2 weeks.
And in Mr. Barton's thoughts, what should happen is if this PIC process occurs, it should be a sign that it is a safer environment, that you don't need the PRTs, that the NGO types, the State Department development types should be able to go in there unattended, but that in fact is not going to be the reality, and it's not the reality, and it means that the work is not going to get done. And the last comment I would say, it just seems once again, Mr. Aiken, I know Ms. Davis feels this way and others, that this whole issue of foreign language training from the time we were in grade school, I mean, we still as Americans are abysmal in the emphasis we put throughout our educational system. We don't solve it by starting when people are 25 and in the 5th year of their military career and saying, gee, now's a good time for you to learn Farsi or something because we've got a dispute going on along the Iranian border. I mean, that's not going to be the way that we're going to solve this. We as Americans are going to have to start putting a high priority on this in our kindergartens and grade schools on foreign language, all the varieties of languages. Any further comments, Mr. Aiken?
No. Thank you very much.
Ms. Cruz, Ms. Parker, Mr. Barton, we appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Sorry we started later. Members may have some questions for the record they may want to ask you, and if you can get those back. Since you all don't have to have things I don't think approved by OMB, we appreciate you getting those back in a timely fashion. Thank you all.